This week on the Ownership Economy podcast, we talk with Joshua Tan, a practitioner fellow at Stanford's Digital Civil Society Lab and the executive director of the Metagovernance Project. The Metagovernance Project is building standards and infrastructure for digital self-governance. Joshua's work focuses on how to build modular governance systems from the ground up. It's like unbundling the cooperative model into governance rights and earning mechanisms, and then allowing organizations to choose the modules they want to use, all powered by the composability of cryptography and distributed ledger technologies. We go from there into topics of progressive decentralization and DAO to DAO coordination. Hope you enjoy this week's podcast. So I'm going to hand it over to Jahed now to introduce Joshua. We're really excited to be following up this podcast right after Nathan Schneider because they've done work together. So Jahed, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Martin. So Joshua, thanks for joining us. Just to kind of kick this thing off, I met you at the DAOist conference in real life, IRL, out in Lisbon. And then a few weeks after that, before that, we had actually, I lucked into the Metagov project online. I think I just saw it on Twitter randomly. And then we did a short call. And basically, like Martin said, I was surprised I hadn't heard of you because, Nathan Schneider, you're involved with him. You're doing a lot of cool stuff there. So basically, I guess the good way to start with this is just to say, how did you first get involved in this space?
Yeah, of course. First of all, thanks for having me here. It's really a great pleasure. And I've always enjoyed the conversations I've had with you. Lots of fun, including one that maybe we'll get into later on about DAO dystopias.
Absolutely, we will get
such
to
a
that.
Fun conversation topic. We don't necessarily want to build the dystopias, but they're kind of fun to think about. But I got into this space. So my background is as a kind of, I'm a theoretical computer scientist / mathematician. I kind of grew up mainly in pure math. And I got into online governance kind of very roundabout way. I was in Berlin consulting / helping out at this video game company called Clang. And they were building this game called Seed. It's kind of like a sandbox MMO. Kind of imagine like Minecraft meets The Sims meets EVE Online. And the idea is the Seed was what they wanted to do was have this completely sandbox environment in which politics was also part of that sandbox. So having tooling to support, building of democracies and oligarchies or, eco-fascist terrorist groups or Game of Thrones, or literally there would be trial of combats every, on the regular. And there I met this person named Lawrence Lessig. So Larry is I had no idea, but he's like a very, very well-known, well-respected lawyer, constitutional scholar. And I was there kind of helping them design their economy. And Larry was there kind of advising them on their politics.
Yeah.
And we just got started talking. Like Larry's desk was literally next to mine. And
super cool.
Larry then invited me to help him teach a class at Harvard Law School on the governance of virtual worlds. And that's basically how I got started. Metagov itself actually kind of grew out immediately was an immediate product from us teaching this class. We essentially started Metagov with two of the folks that we had invited as speakers to that class.
Super cool. And I think it's funny you say that because I'm looking at the description of Metagovernance Project, right? An interdisciplinary research group working on the governance of virtual worlds. It's right there, jumping right out of that group. Yeah.
Yeah. The class is literally called Governing Virtual Worlds.
So basically, you kind of already did this, but we do like to make sure that we break jargon down for people. And I mean, when you know this as well as anyone, when you jump into Web3, it is just like new term, new weird term. It's like, what is this? Can you, kind of the classic ELI 5, explain it to me like I'm 5 for this Metagovernance project?
Right. What is Metagov? Long story short, we conduct research on online governance. And more specifically, we try to build things that make it easier for communities to build their own form of governance. Kind of like the original vision that I just described from this video game called Seed. We wanted to make it possible. The internet is not exactly a video game, though. Look at certain parts of crypto, it feels a little bit like it.
Definitely.
And the idea is like, what kind of tools can we give people? Or another way of thinking about it, how do I make the tools that already exist more accessible so that people can truly build, their own kinds of governance systems, from oligarchies to democracies to, very complicated kinds of token economies.
Yeah.
Using like these kinds of building blocks. How do I make that sort of process more accessible, easier, so that we can just encourage more playfulness in governance or more experimentation. That's really what we're all about.
Got it. So, this is I have my own little interview guide here, but you're just so interesting to talk to that I just have to jump right into this. So when you talk about tools to make, governance experimentation more playful, to explore possibilities, stuff like that, why don't you tell us about a few of those tools, right? Like I've looked at Metagovernance Project. I've seen there's things like Agreement Engine, Metagov Gateway, but people are dealing with, as you know, real life nitty gritty institutional governance problems, and whether they're in a video game or whether they're in like Discord or raising money for a standard company, they're going to deal with stuff like this. So what are some of the tools that you've developed for these sort of ecologies?
Of course. So the main tool that we work on is called the Metagov Gateway. And the gateway itself is, in one sense, it's like very straightforward. It's an API gateway that's designed for online communities. So existing API gateways are kind of more, they're backend services that consume a bunch of other backend services and make them more accessible to, you could say, like front-end developers or end users that need to like query these systems to extract some sort of like, analytics data or for a dashboard or things like that. A lot of like large enterprises, and then even like not so large enterprises, like have these gateways just because they like at some point you have like too many API sort of endpoints and they just like, it gets too complicated. For online communities, there's a slightly different use case, but it's like, it is still intended to target online communities that are a little bit more complex or who want to build more complex forms of essentially governance or sort of community interaction, right? Imagine some communities, especially the more successful ones, have anywhere from like 3 Discord servers, 10 Telegram channels. It's like terrifying. Bots on like different Telegram channels and different Discord channels and different Slack channels that actually need to interact somehow because they're pulling data to like a common library, like SourceCred, for example, or maybe there's Coordinate. There's like, for online communities that kind of are digitally native, you often use like an incredible number of different like digital services.
Definitely.
And if you want these things that talk to each other in any kind of way, you need something like an API gateway, or you just need to spend a lot of money on, developers to maintain your backend.
Got it. So that's Metagov Gateway then.
Yes.
Got it.
The gateway also ships with a couple of kind of like tools, especially something called Policy Kit that is like currently the primary consumer of the gateway. So basically the idea is like, if you go into a Slack or a Telegram or whatever, there's some sort of basic administration or governance that just comes with it. Like you're the owner of the channel, or there's an admin role. But oftentimes, like these services don't expose like all the different ways. There are like lots of things that they don't expose, and there's lots of ways of controlling and sort of like I'd say like automatically moderating, these kinds of services, or gatekeeping, right? Something that CoLabLand does that the services for the platforms themselves don't provide. And Policy Kit is basically an add-on that's like ships with the gateway that makes it immediately viable to sort of build operational governance policies directly on top of these platforms. So it's consuming the Metagov Gateway, consuming all these API endpoints in order then essentially to overlay the governance and essentially replace the governance of the normal governance of Discord with something that you decide for yourself.
Got it. And so like, for us here, for Martin and I, the reason why we started this, one of them, right, is that we are principally interested in like, what is this ownership economy? Why is it so important? Well, really, one of our theses is that when you involve more people in governance, you're going to have, broader, more accessible and more complex information processing capabilities. If you kind of zoom out and say like, oh, we're incorporating more data sources, right? And so like, that's one of the things where we think that if you do that and you give people tools to do that, you're going to create more economic value. You're going to be able to distribute that value more effectively eventually, right? Like that's just one of the core theses of ownership in general, right? It's why these folks are out here going like, we need a creator platform. We need to give creators governance in the platform so that they're not outside of it, like in Patreon, and just kind of saying, please let us in and tell you what we need, right? So when I look at some of these tools, right, like Agreement Engine, Metagov Gateway, Policy Toolkit, like, what do you think are the possibilities there to address things like this in the ownership economy?
So these are all like small niche tools that address like a set of use cases. Let's put it that way. And what we're really hoping, and what we will be building kind of in the next phase of development in Q1, Q2 of 22, is what I think of as like Anaconda for governance. Guys, heard of Anaconda. It's kind of like a
No, please explain.
data science package that just, basically it's a package manager and a distribution that just makes it really easy to use this suite of tools like for data scientists. And what we're hoping to do is just make it really easy to sort of download and install a wide selection of different tools for online communities. Now, for the ownership economy specifically, I think I would have to better understand what you mean by ownership in these cases. But my general sense is that, like, when you have ownership over something, you have a set of rights, right? You're given, it's defined through a set of rights. But generally speaking, like, what we know and what we observe is that it's like oftentimes like people don't really exercise these rights. That's a huge problem, but it's been a problem for a long time, right? It's been a problem for, like, engagement has been a big problem for lots of online communities throughout the history, even when they didn't have like explicit rights, right?
Yeah.
So I guess what I would say is, like, part of the reason we, got together, like these 4 different people working across different parts of the internet, like Larry and I were working on video games, and Louis was working on social networks, Prima was working on blockchains, and realized, like, there are problems that exist across all these different communities that were all related, and that certain solutions have been developed in one part that could be applicable to the other. We didn't know. I mean, it would be interesting to try, but currently it just wasn't making the jump, right? So long story short, I don't know the solutions to how, like, this will ultimately affect the ownership economy or Web3 or crypto or whatever sort of like arena you want to think about. But my sense is, like, let's try to make these solutions a little bit more fluid and a bit more portable so we can sort of, get the entire ecosystem. Let's try out new things and make the sort of barriers to trying new things lower.
Got it. Yeah, that barrier to trying new things being lower is absolutely, like, spot on, right? That's one of the things I love about this space is that people are relentless and trying new things, right? They're just going to go do it. And, when I hearken back to what you and I were talking about at the DAOist conference, right? We were surrounded by about 400 people who are in, decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, right? Ostensibly. But, there's a lot of folks who are just kind of repeating things and not necessarily seeing that, like, hey, if I do this actually completely foreseeable consequence will happen, right? So, like, I'm hearkening back to things like, the IAD framework, right? The institutional analysis and development framework of Ostrom and things like that. But basically, one thing you hinted at here is, like, you want to make, I'm putting words in your mouth here, but you tell me by the sound of it, composable tools, right? Something that, and this is kind of a good segue for us to then say, you've written this great paper to get a little even deeper on this, on composability in complex games, right? And so, we wanted to kind of ask you here, just to kick this off. There's a lot of people doing complex institutional innovation, right? And when we think about ownership, we see it as this is a really complex institutional innovation, right? Like, when you come in here on ownership to date, right? There was the ESOP, that was like one epoch, right? The employee stock plan, that was an epoch of innovation in how we spread governance and wealth, not necessarily governance so much, but definitely wealth, right?
Yeah.
And then, now it kind of seems like you're skating ahead in some ways of the puck, right? In that old saying of, hey, how do we actually give people a framework for complex institutional innovation? That's basically what I took this as. Is that how you would kind of characterize that paper?
Yeah. So that paper was making 2 claims. One is just pointing out that institutional design is really hard. And there's a way that practitioners, and I would include Ostrom, as in the set of practitioners, approach this, right? They do it through these principles, through, querying, like talking to people, Ostrom was really like an ethnographer in a lot of ways.
Yes.
She really went out and talked to people and tried to understand what they were doing. And she was not the kind of economists that we typically associate with games and game theory.
Yes.
That said, so this paper was kind of like attempt to kind of bridge these things. And it was trying to do that was actually like the second hypothesis is really about, well, okay, what are game theorists doing, right? They're building these relatively sort of complex mathematical models that, because of their complexity and how they need to get specified, are fundamentally limited in like how much they can sort of just treat or understand. So, like, there are examples of practical, like, people model like certain parts, certain like situations in game theory. Like, I think there was a paper on hydroelectric systems and the design of these things in India. But, when you design these like hydroelectric systems, like oftentimes, like when you build the dams, that impacts like downstream, like farming communities, as well as like lots of different other stakeholders besides just like, producing power at a certain cost.
Yeah.
And, there was a very I think a nice paper kind of like using game theory to understand these things, but they just, at some point they said like, okay, we literally cannot model like the impacts on these farming communities and how they might behave, because it's like, there's just too much. There's like any kind of one of these projects has like so many downstream implications. And then, of course, the point of game theory is that it's not only downstream. When something has an implication for a set of actors, they can sort of, if they're rational, they can see it happening and like compensate and do something that you don't necessarily expect. That's why game theory gets you like into really interesting situations in equilibria. And anyways, so compositional game theory is a mathematical formalism that tries to address this problem. And the pitch of the paper was that really kind of articulating that if you want to address this problem, you have to reframe game theory as something that's mathematical, and that you build in these like ivory towers, as something more of like as a programming practice. And compositional game theory gives you a kind of like a mathematical specification for building that programming language, and we build part of that programming language. And now we're trying to sort of like practice it.
Got it.
And so we're saying, okay, if you really want to use game theory to build up to these institutional designs that Ostrom was already doing back in the 80s, we need to start approaching this as a kind of like computational discipline and import all the tools and sort of principles we developed in software engineering. And this is kind of like how we should do it.
That's amazing. And I mean, like, I'm gonna have to ask you ELI5, explain it to me like I'm 5 again, but only on one term. Actually, we were just talking about this before you hopped on. I think that composability is a super interesting idea within this. And so can you tell us, what do you define as composability? Is it a mathematical construct? Is it something that, maybe is a little more colloquial? How should we think about that before we jump into how to use these frameworks?
Yeah. So in my field, composition has a very specific term. Usually think of it as like function composition, right?
Yeah.
Another way of thinking about composability is that if I get one object of a certain type, another object of another type, I can stick them together. I have objects of type A, another object of type A, and I can stick them together to form another object of type A, right? So it's very strict in some sense. Composability is actually can be like a relatively strict condition. There's another notion that's related that people kind of talk about much more colloquially, which is modularity, right? This idea of I have a module here, in software engineering, I can install it without thinking about the others. So it's like the one's independent from the other. Composition and modularity are related, but they're not the same concept.
Got it. And so it's funny you said that, because we were talking, our side came from like, I was drawing on like Herbert Simon stuff to kind of explain like, oh, this is probably what composability means, which is, that's like the modularity hierarchy type thing that he was talking about. But anyway, the composable thing is very interesting, because when you look out on the space right now in blockchain, there's a number of protocols who are like, oh, we have to be composable. We're composable first. We're building public goods. We got to build open source, right? And so like, just to give you one example, Toucan protocol, which I believe you might have been sitting at the table with me at the DAOist next to me or nearby when the Toucan people were talking. But Toucan is building this infrastructure for basically carbon and DeFi, right? So like they're trying to bring carbon, as if you think about it in the composable sense, as like a new money Lego, right, to Web3. They want to make it like a type within kind of, if I'm using your language right. And so like one of the cool things they're doing is they have this thing called Toucan Bridge, and it basically just does one thing. It's just, you're a person who owns legacy carbon credits on chain, and they're off chain, right? And what happens is you're going to buy those things, and then like that's it. People do it as like a show, right? They lock those up. They buy the $1 ones until Klima showed up a couple of weeks ago. But then the whole point of those is to bring your legacy carbon credits on chain, making them composable with almost every DeFi protocol. Right. So like if I told you that was happening, right, and maybe, someone like in Toucan is sitting there thinking through something like compositional game theory, how does something like that become real for them? What do you think about that idea?
So composability on chain, like I think just like the word gets used in all sorts of different ways. And if they mean like, it can mean, one, just the sense of modularity, right? I think when sometimes I feel like, for example, like Zodiac, like Gnosis Zodiac uses like the composability language, and really they're talking about modularity in those cases. When you talk about composability on chain in the sense of like, one token being kind of transferable or interoperable on another one, that's what I would kind of associate more with maybe interoperability. I think I still need to better understand that notion. Just like the fact that it appears on this thing, now it can appear on this thing, and it's like it's transactable, right? So I built a plugin that sort of makes it easy for like transactions to go through.
Yeah.
So that's that's more like interoperability, right? And then composability is, I would say, like relatively rare in blockchain. It's relatively rare in a lot of software engineering, because composability in the way that, it's defined technically really looks much, I mean, like it happens all the time and at a basic level. It's just function composition. People compose things all the time, like compose functions, like a developer will compose functions.
Yeah.
But it's very hard to sort of like support that at the level of, these really complex, software entities. I will say that this is actually the subject of like existing research. So like my collaborators, Jules Hedges, Philip Zahn, computer scientists and economist, respectively, they're currently doing this research for the Ethereum Foundation to support more verifiable contracts, right? Actually to truly make sure that these like economic concepts are composable in the way that, is in a way that is rigorous, right?
Gotcha. And so that if you're writing it on one blockchain, it's composable across, say, all of them, if it's actually done in a reproducible way.
Yeah, let's use the word reproducible.
Right? Reproducible. Got it. Cool, man. And then I think like when you think of composability in the space, the reason why we're like doubling down on that, at least, you walk through 3 really interesting use cases, but one, and, please correct me if I'm wrong too, but this one I thought was very interesting. I could be from another one of your papers, but you kind of walk through this example that, if you've been in, it depends on when you're entering the Web3 space, because as you know, there's just every day it's like a full-time job to stay up on this space. But everything is changing so fast. But one of the models that's been around for a few years, which a lot of people put some steam behind, is this idea of a like benevolent dictator for life, right? Mm-hmm. And like this seems to be happening in a lot of, you look into the real world, there's a lot of examples of this, right? Like I think of Chobani, if you've heard of the yogurt company, right? They literally have a version of this out right now in that the founder of that company, started 15 years ago. He, bootstrapped it. And just recently, when you think about, this is one of the cases I like to point to in the ownership economy, right? Is that the founder of this company then decided about 3 or 4 years ago to give, he was like the way by far majority owner of his company, but he actually realized the contribution of his employees to date and literally just created like 100 millionaires overnight when he said, hey, I'm actually going to give equity to and majority control of my company to the people who built it in the last 15 years. Right. And so like, that's almost like a real world example of your benevolent dictator for life. And so I guess coming around to this, right, when you think of like this modular politics and composability, right, one of the really interesting ideas is that use case that you walk through with BDFL, right? Where you're like, here we have a person who started an amazing open source project, and she, at the very end of it, actually has transitioned into the community over time and used the construct itself to bridge herself back into it, right? And if I'm explaining it right, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically when I was looking through modular politics, right, you're basically saying that it helps, a person launch this project, she becomes a benevolent dictator, creates a lot of value over time, but then she eventually channels her own role through the system she created, right? And like, so now us, we're super interested in, not just starting new projects, but, this is a model that we see as the future in a lot of ways, that you decentralize governance so that it becomes an advantage in how you grow the company and all that. So is this kind of how you see it playing out with this BDFL sort of transition? Like, how far do you see that sort of playing out?
So a lot of projects do typically start out from, let's take a single founder or a set of like a small group of founders, right? Especially if you're building like technology, this is just like how it typically works. And then there's, I'm sure you guys have talked about this before, some notion of progressive decentralization that's certainly popular in Web3 circles, but is also, has been a pattern in just the rest of the economy for like hundreds of years, right?
Yeah.
A lot of like us, what we're trying to do right now is figuring out better ways of supporting and incentivizing this kind of decentralization.
Yeah.
Or this kind of like, or what I think of as like a governance transition of some sort, right? So the paper itself just specifies, this is something that happens. You build these systems for, you have a beginning system, which might be like a BDFL. And then you have some sort of target system, which is, the end state. And then, it gives a little bit of sort of taste of what the transition might be. But I think that's like, well, I don't think the paper is trying to articulate something a little bit different, but focusing on that example, like this is absolutely, I think, one of the most critical subjects that we are trying to sort of figure out in Metagov right now. And if you talked to Nathan earlier, then he very likely talked about like exit to community, right?
Yeah.
This idea of how do I support private companies who want to sell or transition to some sort of like community ownership, kind of along the patterns of like the original ESOPs, but now transitioning to like a larger sort of community of stakeholders. And what I would sort of like focus on is not just the beginning and the end, but the middle. What is that transition period? How is that supported? How is that governed? How do I facilitate and incentivize people to sort of undertake that process and reduce the risk involved in it, right? I think until we kind of resolve that question, we're not going to see as many cases as we would like of this like pattern of exit to community or this pattern of like, community ownership, just because most projects do start out with these BDFLs or sort of some sort of like small scale ownership. And then, we don't really have a good answer for like how to support that transition yet and how to sort of de-risk it for the people who are starting the process.
So I just want to follow up on one thing there. So when it came to ESOPs, one of the big kind of reasons that a founder might want to transition their company to ownership from their employees is there's actually a huge tax benefit to doing that. So it's written into the legislature, right? And so there's this regulatory environment that supports that. And at the same time, so you have this regulatory and policy component of this that supports the transition to broader ownership. At the same time, when the Chobani founder started, he didn't know he was going to be a billionaire, right? He just bought this kind of random factory up in upstate New York, right? And somehow made $1 billion off of yogurt, which is amazing. But then he decides he wants to transition, And so how do you deal with intentionality here, right? Like, because I would think that when I think of kind of the governance layer that is being built in these communities, the rules are being set in the beginning or they're being set over time, right? And so when you think about the fact that intentionality within these entrepreneurs can change, and maybe not everyone is open to this idea of a fully decentralized or decentralizing their firm today, but they might want to in the future. How do the systems that you're building kind of account for that? And so I guess there's two questions there. One, what's the policy environment that's required to support this? And then two, how do you deal with this kind of middle, not the start or the end, but really kind of how intentionality of that core team might actually change over time. And so they might not want to put these things into the project at the beginning, but they might actually want to do it over time.
So speaking to the second first, and I do actually really want to talk about like how we can support the regulatory environment for these kinds of initiatives. I guess I would just like, the way I would sort of think about this is try to break up this kind of decentralization as many stages, in discrete stages as possible, like tiny little steps, right? So, in the Web3/DAO space, you see a lot of like financial decentralization and operational decentralization happening at the same time. I think like Shapeshift tried to do this, right? Whereas, for ESOPs, you just have like financial decentralization without much operational decentralization because essentially it's still like run as a hierarchy. And even in financial decentralization, I still honestly need to do more research and understand this space better. I feel like that could be cut up in sort of different sort of discrete steps that sort of like de-risk it. Or another way of thinking is just like you offer a smorgasbord of different options and different teams with different sort of intentions or different interests will pick different ones that suits their circumstance, right? But they need to be aware of these options and they need to be given some sort of like demonstration or some sense of like, this is what's happened before and these were the results, right? To have some sort of comfort with pursuing one of these strategies. I'll definitely say like the people I interact with that want to do some sort of like transition of this sort or some sort of exit to community tend to be like relatively ideologically motivated, right? I mean, there's different kind of levels of this. There's a lot of people interested in this are, companies that haven't necessarily found like a market niche yet. So they're still kind of iterating on their business model while they're sort of also like thinking about, these kinds of like what I think of as like an exit or like the ownership and eventual governance of that product, which I think I understand why. My sense is like, maybe that's not the best of your time and resources to be focusing on these kind of questions while like you're still trying to figure out what the core product and market you're trying to address is. But yeah, just speaking to this ideology question, like ideology still plays a large role in these kinds of exits. I don't think it's something yet that is like truly motivated by like a company that's just purely profit maximizing company is considering these communities exits just for the sake of making as much money as possible. That said, I would really be interested in exploring and we're trying to do some research on this in how, different forms of executive community could support these kinds of like essentially incentivized from a purely profit-based angle. And that ties into your first question, essentially. Like if the regulatory environment, sort of like, you kind of like, sort of there are tax credits for like carbon offsets or tax credits for, wind power. What if we had credits of some sort to support ownership transitions of this sort to make that kind of like cost benefit calculus tilted a little bit more toward like trying some of these more risky, newer models for ownership that have yet to be proven, potentially could have huge impacts on the economy, I think at the level of, wind power or renewable energy taking over for sort of fossil fuel-based kinds of energy production.
Martin.
Yeah, so just on that point, I think one last kind of thought on that, just to close it back with the conversation with Nathan. And so, Joshua, one of the things that came up last week is kind of the Howey test and how some of these founders that are building tokens might actually be choosing to allocate more to the community through kind of decentralization so that they don't qualify as a security and the token actually qualifies as a token, right? And so like that would be an example of one of these kind of soft regulatory nudges that the SEC decided to make to essentially say, okay, if there's not one company that actually governs this token and you don't have control, then you can treat this as a utility, even though it might have all the same elements of a security because it's fungible, because you can convert it into fiat fairly easily. And so these teams are essentially saying, well, if I can take 10% of something that's more likely to be $1 billion company and I don't have to deal with all the securities regulation, then fine, I'll take 10%. So maybe there's more examples like this over time that you kind of develop through the project.
Yeah. So like, actually, I do like this tip on progressive decentralization, right? I kind of want to turn it a little bit on its head, be interested in almost both of your opinions on this actually. So the Hive project, Joshua, have you heard of Hive?
You mean One Hive or Hive?
One Hive. Sorry, you're correct. One Hive. The folks, Michael Zargon, who is a person that you kind of collaborate with, is involved with them, right? They released this really interesting paper, which we'll put in the show notes for the listeners. It's not a paper on their Substack where they basically said the focus of it is DAOs and the pitfalls of progressive decentralization. And so like, this is a really interesting concept because they basically walk through the, almost like in a case study kind of way. And they say like, hey, yeah, A16Z and other people are putting out all these things on how to progressively decentralize and start as a benevolent dictator for life. But as Martin pointed out, there's now this strong incentive around maybe actually you should start that way because you won't be a security. And then on the other side of it, you hinted at this with product market fit is that there's a lot of people who are coming out and saying actually like, product market fit, though it matters, it's important, you still need a fiercely loyal community. Whether that community is customers, whether it is, some people who are building alongside the project, you actually need that. And progressively decentralizing can actually hinder the growth of that community and the culture it creates. So I know you're involved with a lot of different people. What's your take on that?
So the question is challenging the existing norm around progressively decentralizing, building centrally, and then kind of exiting to community.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what if you started that way? What are the, in your opinion, could the trade-offs be? What are the hurdles? What are the really obvious problems?
I mean, as an organization that kind of like, communities are very different. Like different communities are very different. And if you have like a core team that's like effective, that's like managing things and is like on top of it, even as a community, that is very different from just like a mass of random people showing up on a Twitch channel. Right. And obviously that's both structured by the technology that exists, as well as, to be fair, most of it is just about like the kind of people and the trust that they have with each other. So you can't get away from that soft element. Yeah. And if you have this like, cohesive community that's like able to sort of take things and build things, then why not run with it? I haven't seen that many examples of this like being like super working out. But then again, I don't think like there are that many examples, period, of like this being attempted. Yeah. And if the regulatory sort of environment is favoring, then, I'm here to support these kind of experiments. I love it. That said, it's like, I guess I have these kinds of thoughts to myself all the time, actually, about, so like Metagov, just by the nature of what it is, it works with a lot of communities, right? Especially lots of communities that are more already like to some degree community governed. And these organizations typically are just like much slower moving. They take time to make decisions. They take time to come to consensus. A lot of times they don't necessarily know what they really want. Yeah. And it's like a long process for them to figure that out. This is, it's frustrating on our part because like, in many ways we're a startup, right? And we're trying to figure out like, how to achieve product market fit, how to sort of iterate our offering to, be usable by these communities. But it's like so slow working with some of those folks. It's like it's not something like we think is wrong. It's just like this, like we know this is the nature of these kinds of communities, but like how can we improve that? How can we sort of like get the ecosystem as a whole to move faster, make faster decisions? Because it's just like a cascade type effect. If I'm making, like, I need to make this decision, but it depends on these decisions, which then depends on these things. If the entire ecosystem of like, BDFLs makes, you can have this thing where like the BDFLs ecosystem of like private companies, make decisions like in, 5 hours, the time that would take a week for this ecosystem of community-driven organizations.
Right.
And that's a problem, right? That's a huge problem.
Yeah. Well, actually, to jump out on that as well, do you see this primarily as a tooling problem? Because there's so many DAO tooling and other things out there, or do you really still kind of see this as a problem of social complexity?
I think honestly, it's social complexity. I don't think it's just tooling. Another way of thinking about it is that, social complexity throws around it generates problems. It's like an amazing problem generator, right?
Yeah.
You solve, it's like whack-a-mole. You have these technologies and you can whack one mole that comes out, but then like the social structure changes, some new sort of pattern arises, and then you need to build a new kind of like workflow to support that.
Yeah.
There's no single tech solution that's going to solve all the problems of social complexity. So it's not, you could obviously have better platforms, but they need to be constantly evolving. And that's not how I think platforms are set up or designed. They solve like
this point in time.
This point in line for these communities, and like, and that's okay. But so, it's really difficult.
Well, I think this is where you and I kind of vibed in real life when we were in Lisbon, is like, I think you said something to me like, that you liked, though I have my own ideological motivations. I'm honestly just kind of out here thinking, how do we get more people to play in this space, right? Kind of in the same way that you're thinking. How do we make it, how do you, Nathan, and other folks build tools that make it easier to play with the possibilities here, right? And so like, I think that, having said that, then one of the other things that comes up, and I just want you to kind of ruminate on this, is, this social complexity that results from, honestly, a number of incentives, like, like Martin said, let's not be a security, let's progressively decentralize. That's going to present certain social hurdles to making decisions. The people on the other side of this, who maybe are a little bit more ideologically motivated even than me, might say, well, given a fiercely loyal community, you'll find product market fit. It'll emerge organically because the community can now be your customer and a co-designer. How does that sound to you?
Ambitious, but risky.
Yeah.
You can have there are people that are into these, existing Web3 systems for like massive amounts of money, but are still disengaged from the governance, right? Why would, even if you have like a kind of like a great community, like how can you get them to I guess just long story short, I'm not convinced yet of the advantages of just like saying I have this community and it's going to like magically solve my product market fit problems.
Yeah,
they're engaged, but there are plenty of how do I say it? Like for-profit hierarchical organizations that also have like engaged communities.
Very true.
So it's not like you're competing with, it's somehow, I'm just not convinced that ownership on its own is going to the magic sauce that solves everything. I think it needs to be ownership plus lots of other things.
I think you're right, because we are humans. There's at least been two forms of motivation objectified by the various people who study it, right? And whether or not you say that they're real object, intrinsic and extrinsic, right? So it can't necessarily just be ownership and what do I get out of it? Because like you said, I can point to any number of Web2 communities from here to the horizon that basically have a really thriving community. It's just about what you call that community, right? And I see a lot of parallels here. There's a number of the Airtable community, right? When you look at some of the SaaS companies and things that people are trying to build, those people, when you talk to them, they're crazy about Airtable and they're crazy about their little small business, right? It's it lets me do this, that, and the other. It enables me to achieve this. And so I think the Web3 people, Martin gets in my case for jargon, and he's right, by the way. I'm not poking fun at him for this, but you have so much impenetrable complexity and jargon on what the thing is. And where I think that even that's like a barrier to this, sort of forming a useful community, right?
I guess I would just say, maybe this is something that came up in honestly, this is something that Nathan taught me. I think it's really correct. But that like a lot of ways we're in this space where we need to train ourselves and build skill sets to be a community. We need to learn how to become better communities.
Yes.
We're not necessarily taught that in our day and age. We're focused on building kind of our individual skill sets in order to build a career. And kind of like the thing we need to do in order to really get for Web3 to become successful. We need some underlying sort of infrastructure, whether it be tokens or rights or whatever platforms to support this. But we also need to train each other to be better people in the community, to learn how to work together in this kind of format that's not a hierarchical, like somebody giving me orders, telling me what to do, right? I think that's going to be critical to making this entire project successful.
Martin, did you?
Yeah, so I just have a question where I'm trying to kind of pull this together in my own mind. So my background has always been kind of in these operational roles and more kind of on the investor side. But where I get kind of a little bit thrown off by this is, what's the heuristic essentially for thinking through what a successful community looks like and whether or not the governance in that community is actually successful, right? Because governance, like when you think of it from the perspective of stakeholder theory, you've got this kind of claim on resources. And the whole point of governance is essentially to make sure that your claim on those resources from the community is protected, right? And so that's where ownership comes in, and that's why it's important, right? But in kind of the work that you're doing, like how do you think about this is a vibrant community, this is a intentional community, this community is achieving the goal when you don't have so simple of a kind of a way of measuring success, right? A quantitative kind of pecuniary measure, right? And so like, how have you seen that play out in the communities that you've been involved with? And how are people trying to measure whether or not the governance layer and the modularity of that governance layer kind of is successful in advancing the goals of the community?
So the question is, to what degree, like, how do we evaluate the success of governance software, but also governance interventions? Policies?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, it was like so much of like, if you think of the traditional firm, right? Like so many of like you judge kind of the success of governance on or protection of minority rights or protection of kind of particular aspects of governance based on whether or not they actually protect your ownership interest, right? Like that's the real reason why governance exists in firms, right? Or in companies. So in these communities where you're building, how are you actually able to step back and say, this particular modular kind of governance toolkit that we built was successful?
So I hesitate to sort of like, so the point is like, if it's not just about protecting ownership interest, or is it?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. If it's not just about it, like protecting ownership interest actually makes it easier, right? Because I either lost money or I didn't, right? Or I lost my rights to that claim on the cash flows of that company, or I didn't, right? And I either go to court and protect those or I didn't, right? So it's way more binary and it's way simpler. And I think this goes to what you were just saying about we need to learn how to be in a community. And I'm just wondering, have some of these things that you've been working on, have you actually identified things that have worked and not worked? And have there been specific learnings about some of the modular tools that you've built that were unexpected?
So one of the things that we're trying to build that's really challenged our kind of expectations and kind of assumptions going into some of these discussions is, like I'm a computer scientist by training. And I do like to think of like, here's a metric that we need to optimize. We're like or a panel of metrics, like some KPIs, right? But I've been working with this community of artists called Dada that's essentially starting its own DAO and needs to define its own governance. And they're quite honestly a Dadaist community in the kind of original political economics, form from, Dada art, right?
Yeah.
And they don't want any metrics because to them, having metrics defeats the purpose of the community. Because the point of the community is that you have intrinsic motivations to be in there. Whereas, having metrics and, ownership protection and having these numbers associated with it that you're trying to optimize defeats that purpose. It's the extrinsic motivation, right? Counter to community. On the other hand, this is also like an online community. It's very digital. And the thing about computers, everything needs to be quantified or formalized in some sense. It needs to get represented. So how do you square, this square with that circle? It's really difficult. So I am trying to build or come up with a system right now for like, how do I sort of have a automated quantitative system running on the back end, but that is as invisible as possible to people on the front end, then how is the system going to be governed? Does the sort of numbers become visible at some point? Are the numbers just like different kind of quantities that cannot be evaluated? I don't have lessons from this yet, but I would say that one sort of paradigm that I sort of use for thinking about this is that there are three sets of incentives. Let's say there's like kind of the sort of Web3 ownership incentives, right, around having money or a stake and sort of making money that way. There's what I would think of as the Web2 platform incentives. So like this is how you design like a really like Airtable or some sort of product or Facebook, something that's like really wonderful to use just on its own. Sometimes too wonderful to use, too addictive, right?
Yeah.
But nonetheless, like these are things that you like, people participate in these communities and, facilitate some sort of peer production because of the way that the platform designs that experience, that way of engaging with the community, right? And then third, there's the fact of like engaging with communities themselves, like having sort of social connections, these network effects, which is tied to Web2, or at least like most successful Web2 companies, but it's not necessarily, doesn't have to be part of it, right? It can be a little bit separate and obviously existed before Web2 was ever a thing. So how can I sort of design all these things together into like a package of incentives to facilitate these emerging new kind of digital economies? That's like the real question, I think. But you need to have a sense of what the tools you're working with are.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's early days, right? But I think like the more that we have examples of, the more kind of edge cases that we develop over time, the easier it's going to be for someone who is not deep in this to come in and say, I'd like to give more governance rights to this kind of value creating stakeholder in my company, but my company's been around for 20 years and I don't want to mess things up, or I'd like to kind of move beyond an ESOP, because the reality is we use a lot of vendors and we can't use an employee stock option because of regulation, right? And so having these kind of modular packets of governance and ownership rights or kind of incentive structures that you talk about, I think will be very, very useful over time for people that, are attracted to this idea, but also have a lot to lose if they get it wrong, right? And so creating these on-ramps, as you mentioned, I think is really important.
So Joshua, it is the hour. Do you have time for a DAO Dystopia lightning round, or do you have to jet?
Sure. Let's do a DAO Dystopia lightning round. Let's jump into it.
Excellent. So, I mean, I could throw some ideas out there. There's like building a Squid Game on the blockchain. There's all kinds of terrible things you can do, right? You could make this Dada community you talk about, you could make their lives hell if you had some extremely legible, composable thing that quantified every last action and contribution to the DAO. Oof. That would just be their hell, their version of hell, right? What do you got?
I think the scariest dystopia that I have is maybe a little bit too real. It's a world in which all these kind of like true believers in community and collective ownership hop onto a platform or start using a tech stack that is still, pretty much an oligarchy. And all the work that you were doing ends up just accruing sort of capital to a small set of very rich people who then, aren't necessarily like evil, but not necessarily perfect and have their own biases. And then you have a world in which Web3 looks a lot like Web2. And let's remember, Web2 had lots of like, high idealism, right?
Yeah. You took the air out of the room, man. Because I think that's the worst DAO idea of all time, which is just reproducing the world we already have. All of that work, all of that compute, all of that distribution, just to rebuild the same structures we inhabit. A gut punch.
That's dystopia for you, man.
Oh man, that's good. I mean, with that, that's probably a good place to end. And like I said, I will say before we jump off, please show your project. Where can people find you online? Where can they learn more about Joshua Tan and everything he's doing?
Yeah, please check out metagov.org. We have lots of projects going on all the time. We have everything from, hardcore backend engineering to Web3 experiments to social science studies from everything from crypto politics to, in fact, a recommendation engine, kind of responding to what Martin was going on about, to kind of evaluate how do we validate the performance of these governance software interventions? How can we start recommending one versus the other? We're just starting to explore that. So Metagov is an open sort of research community, lots and lots of different people with different levels of engagement working together to build this quote unquote governance layer for the internet. And awesome. We would really love to have everybody jump on board and help out.
Awesome. And then also, just to further shield the project for you, Metagov is hiring, yes?
Yes, we are hiring. We are looking for a backend research engineer, as well as, this hasn't been posted yet, but a kind of like a COO/community manager position. And we would love to bring people on board. We just got a few nice new big grants and are really looking to expand.
Awesome. So, please find Joshua online, and you can also join his DAO Dystopia channel in the Metagovernance Slack, and you can ideate all day as you work on the side on new tools for the metagovernance. So, Joshua, thanks a lot for joining us. This was super fun, kind of ideating on future worlds, on current tools and all that. Super great. Always great to talk to you. And
yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. See you around, Joshua.
All right. There you
Joshua, thanks so much for your time, man. Talk to you soon.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
My girl gave me a book.